Hi everyone, and thank you again for watching Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode we're going to take a look at the Aputure Storm 1000C, which has their Blair-cg light engine. In this episode we're going to take a look at how the light performs with its different reflectors. I'm going to give you a bit of an in-depth look into their Fresnel. We'll do some brightness comparisons to the Evoke 900, as well as a direct colour vector comparison. We'll also have all of my DMX Cue testing, and as usual all of my spectrometer information will also be in the episode. Now I'll go into quite a bit of detail, so this is a long episode, so it is indexed and chaptered, so you can skip to the sections you want to watch or skip the sections that you don't. Let's start off with the usual disclaimers. Aputure are not paying me any money for this review, and I don't have any financial agreements in place with them. However, they did send me this product for free, and I do get to keep it or sell it at the end of the review. So technically that is a paid endorsement or a paid product placement. And that is something that you should be aware of, because quite possibly on some level that could affect my opinion. Let's go through the pros and cons and start off with the cons first to get those out of the way. And the biggest con for me with this light is the DMX queuing response time. It is about half a second behind every other brand of light that I own. If it wasn't for this DMX queuing issue, I would sell 7 of my Evokes tomorrow and replace them with Storm Series lights. Now the next negative for me is the center of gravity when combined with the tilted stirrup and the Fresnel. So we've got our light stand back here and we've got the weight very forwards, especially if you're spotting the light up. Now when these tilted stirrups first came out, I was a big fan of them, but back in the day, the accessories consisted of reflector dishes and domes and lanterns. Now we've got this heavy Fresnel, but it's quite compact. And even if we put a massive tilt on this, it's not going to hit the stirrup if the stirrup was straight. So this Fresnel is such a go-to accessory. I think a lot of gaffers are going to have this permanently on the light. And I think it's honestly time that Aputure got away from this design and had a straight stirrup that you could adjust the position of. Now the next negative for me is the controller. It's only got the one knob, and yes, I get it. It looks stylish like this, but I don't think the average gaffer cares. We would rather have a light that we can use over one that looks good. Where this thing is really irritating for me is the HSI C+ mode. This is an amazing operating mode, but it has 5 parameters of adjustment. We can adjust our intensity, we can adjust our CCT, we can adjust our green magenta value, we can adjust our color hue, and then we can saturate the color hue in. 5 parameters of adjustment and only the one knob. The next possible negative for some people, especially if you're rigging, is you can only run 7.5 meters of head lead. Now let's cover off the pros. This locking mechanism is incredibly simple to use. You can also set it to work to CIE daylight or track to the plank-in or black body curve. In terms of using this as a white light, it has a fantastic CCT range from 1800 Kelvin up to 20,000 Kelvin, all with complete green and magenta correction to the equivalent of a full correction gel. It has an absolute mountain of DMX profiles. Both the head and the controller are IP65 rated. The output to the light is on the top of the controller, and all of the inputs are on the side. The top row consists of your DMX in, your DMX out, and your USB port. The bottom row has 2 local area network connections, as well as your AC power input, which is universal. On the opposite side, you've got a clamp mounting position for your stand clamp, and you've also got a clamp position on the back. The user interface we will cover later. So continuing on with the pros and cons, I just want to go through my first thoughts when I turn this on for the first time. And not just me, but literally everybody else that I've seen turn this light on and have a play with it has the same experience. And I just want to say here, this is without a camera. This is just how we see things with our eyes. In the CCT mode, everybody's blown away. They really are. You can generate that morning sunlight through a window beautifully with this, with the extended CCT range. But when we put it into the color mode, you can see people literally deflate. Their enthusiasm just disappears and they seem a little bit underwhelmed. And I was incredibly underwhelmed when I put this into its color mode. Again, working by eye and not working off camera. So the first thing you notice is the reds. Most of our RGB ACL lights have a narrow spectrum red, and this really pops out as red because there's nothing else there. Whereas the Storm has a wider spectrum red, which really helps you get more accurate color render in your white light mode, and when mixed together with your other color emitters, generates more accurate color vectors. But when you're looking at it by eye for the first time, and you're trying to make a red, you just can't make a red. It looks like a blood orange. But on camera, when I compare it to other lights, and the other lights by eye look more correct, the Blair light engine actually outperforms them. Now, to give you an idea of how different it looks, by eye and not on camera, this is the Storm compared to an Evoke set to red. And as you can see, the Storm looks more like a deep blood orange than a red. But hold on a sec, if that's how it looks by eye but not on camera, how did I get that picture? Well, I got that picture using an Oppo mobile phone, and I set the white balance to AI. And it does that by AI generating color channel information that doesn't exist. And the other thing too is people seem to expect the color mode to be able to generate way more colors than we could get out of RGB ACL, for example, because this is Blair plus CG. So is there really a tremendous difference between Blair-cg and RGB ACL? Well, let's rearrange the letters and see what we get. So it's essentially RGB ACL plus indigo. So now I'm going to do a color vector test. So I've got the 1000C versus the Evoke 900C. Now both are technically RGB ACL light engines, but they have different emitters. For example, the 1000C has that broad spectrum emitter, and the 900C has a pure red emitter. So the idea of this test is to see what difference that makes with generating other colors. Now both the lights are running over CRMX and receiving their commands via the blackout lighting console. So the graphic in the center of the screen is a direct screen grab from blackout as I'm running these tests. The outside circle is the color selector, and the inside circle is a visual representation of theoretically what the light should be doing when those values are dialed in. So as we do this test, keep your eye on that center circle and compare the results of the lights to that. Now at any point, if the lights do not appear to be the color by eye that they are on camera, I will bring that up. So for example here, at 0 degrees, by eye, the Aputure looks more like an orange and the Evoke looks bright red. Let's begin the test now. Now for those of you who are really technically minded, this has been edited in a split screen. The Aputure side of the screen has been shifted to compensate for the delay in the DMX response. At this point, the Aputure looks more yellow by eye than green. At this point, the Aputure is way more vibrant by eye than it is on camera. And at this point by eye, the Evoke is really popping with its colors. Let's do a quick comparison of all of the modifiers and their brightness. And I've got them listed from least brightest to the most brightest. Now the percentage column in orange is how much brighter the output is compared to having no modifier attached. And right down the bottom here, I've got 5%. And that's just to point out that even though the Fresnel has thousands of lux more than the 15-degree reflector, the difference is only 5%. Now let's have a look at the brightness comparison between the 1000C and the Nanlux 900C. And I see these lights as being direct competition to each other. Now in all fairness, this is something I need to point out. The difference between these lights is not 100 watt, Aputure measure the power draw of the LED light engine, whereas Nanlux measure the power draw of the entire system. Now, I'm not going to compare these to each other with no modifiers attached because they actually have different beam angles, and that would be a little bit unfair on the Evoke 900, but they do have matching 45-degree reflectors. At 3200 Kelvin, the aperture is 11% brighter. At 5600 Kelvin, both lights are almost identical. With primary red, both lights are again almost identical. With primary green, the Evoke is 6% brighter, and with primary blue, the Evoke is 12% brighter. Now, the only other hard light modifier I've got that has matching beam angles is the Fresnels. Now, the Fresnels match up in beam angle in terms of both flood and spot, but the Aputure Fresnel does have some weird spill issues if you're using it without any barn doors, which we'll cover later on. But once you see the difference in brightness, you might be happy with that compromise. At 3200 Kelvin, the aperture comes in at 57% brighter. At 5600 Kelvin, it comes in at 36% brighter. Red is 36% brighter, green is 21% brighter, and blue is 19% brighter. Now, both Fresnels spot up to 15 degrees. And the difference here between the two is huge. At 3200 Kelvin, the aperture is 95% brighter. At 5600 Kelvin, it's 86% brighter. With primary red, it's 87% brighter, green is 71% brighter, and blue is 72% brighter. Now let's take a look at the light with no modifier attached. And the first thing that jumps out at me is it does have a tighter beam than I expected it to have. Now, regardless of the CCT or colour that you dial in, the colour distribution is very even and consistent. At a distance of 3 meters, there is a little bit of soft shadowing, but it's about what I would expect. Now let's take a look at it through a window at a distance of 6 meters, and the shadows are nice and crisp. This is 1800 Kelvin. This is primary red, and the reason it looks pink is because the red is mixing in with the ambient white light. This is primary green. And primary blue. Now let's have a look over a bigger area, and at this distance it does have some reasonable spread and quite an even beam. The beam angle characteristics and light distribution seem to be the same regardless of the colour that you dial in. And just for giggles, let's do a Kelvin sweep. Now let's take a look at this with the F10 Barn Doors. So if you're looking to get maximum width but also have barn door control, this isn't a bad optional extra to buy, because if you buy the Fresnel for this light, you can't use the barn doors without the Fresnel. And just to give you an idea of the control, this is with no modifier attached, and this is with the barn doors on. The spill light around the base of the light is light bouncing off the top barn door. And that's one of my neighbours, curious to see what's going on. Now let's take a look with the supplied wide reflector. Now on camera, this doesn't look all that even, so I thought I'd better give you some separate readings. But note the delta UV. This is set for the daylight curve and it's smack on, and there's no colour hue variation across the beam. It performs like I would expect a dish to perform. Now I've put a light stand in the centre of shot so that you've got something to gauge the shadow differences with. It's pretty even for a faceted reflector, and I do like the way it drops off. Now, regardless of the CCT or colour that you dial in, the colour distribution is very even and consistent. At a distance of 3 metres, the shadows are pretty ordinary. However, at a distance of 6 metres, I was quite impressed with the shadow qualities. It actually does look pretty much like a Fresnel. And the results seem to be the same regardless of the colour that you dial in. Because we've got a bit more intensity with the reflector, red is coming up a bit more red than it was before, but it's still not the sort of red I'm used to seeing off other lights. And if you're lighting up a larger area, you do have a pleasant drop off towards the edge of the beam. And again, the optical characteristics seem to be the same regardless of the colour that you select. Now, all of the data I've collected at the end of the episode is with the light with no modifier attached. So let's take a look at the spectrometer data for this modifier now. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3198 with an SSI score of 86. The TM30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0002, which places it almost perfectly where it should be at this Kelvin. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5603 with an SSI score of 89. The TM30 colour testing results were 97% colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. This is a spectrum distribution, and the white point placement came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0036. So if you're working to the Planchet curve, the light will have a slight green colour hue to roughly about the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. But just to note here, the light is set to CIE daylight, not to the Planchet or blackbody curve. And if you're working to the daylight curve, this is smack on. Now let's take a look at the 30-degree medium reflector, which is an optional extra. And here's some quick spectrometer readouts at 3200 Kelvin. The CCT is very good, and the delta UV is near perfect. And the CCT at 5600 Kelvin is very close, and set to the daylight curve, the white point is also very close to perfect. As far as reflectors go, for a medium reflector, this is pretty good. The consistency of light and shadow across the beam is better than I expected it to be. And the results seem to be consistent regardless of the CCT or colour that you dial in. The shadows at 3 metres are a little bit interesting. However, at a distance of 6 metres, I was actually quite surprised at the detail in the shadows. It's on a par with some Fresnels in flood. For me, this is definitely usable and worth the compromise to get extra light level. And the shadow characteristics seem to be the same regardless of the colour that you dial in. When lighting up larger spaces, you can definitely see the beam diameter of 30 degrees. And it has a nice usable drop-off. And again, the characteristics seem to be the same regardless of colour or CCT dialed in. Now let's take a look at the narrow 15-degree reflector. 3200 Kelvin, the CCT is pretty good, but the delta UV or white point is absolutely spot on. At 5600 Kelvin, everything's a little bit more out, but still respectable if you're working to the daylight curve. As far as the beam characteristics go, this really does look to me to be a 30-degree reflector with a massive hotspot. And the shadow consistency across the beam is reminiscent of what I'd get off an M18. At a distance of 3 meters, the shadows could keep children entertained. But at a distance of 6 meters punching through a window, I was really surprised at the detail. It's not as good as the other reflectors or the Fresnel, but it's definitely usable. When lighting up a large area, you can see what I mean when I say this feels like a 30-degree reflector with a massive hotspot. Now let's take a look at the optional Fresnel. Now first I'm going to show you some interesting characteristics with the spill. In order to show this, I'm exposing for the ambient light in the room. Now if you're an old school gaffer or cinematographer, you would not be expecting this sort of spill issue off a Fresnel. Now I'm doing the exact same thing again, but this time exposing to the light. And as you can see, the issues are not as obvious. But they are there, and there's something to be aware of. And finally, this is a pass with the barn doors on, and the problem is almost completely alleviated. But you can't always work with the barn doors, especially if it's windy, for example. Let's get on with testing, starting with flood first. And this has a very even distribution of light and colour from edge to edge. And the shadows are very consistent like they would be on a good Fresnel. And the drop-off is very pleasant, like I would expect from a regular Fresnel. Now let's have a look at the light spotted up. And the beam edge is a bit different to what you might be expecting from a Fresnel. It's more like the beam edge you'd get off a dado light. This is either a pro or a con, depending on how you're looking to use this. But note it's got a very even distribution of light and colour, and the shadows are very consistent. When it comes to barn door cuts, it does what I expect it to do. And the results seem to be the same regardless of the colour you dial in. At a distance of 3 meters, it has that sort of classical double shadowing that I would expect from a Fresnel this size. Through a window at a distance of 6 meters, it has the shadow qualities that I would expect from a good quality Fresnel. Now let's take a look at it in half spot at 30 degrees. And where this is surprising is the shadow qualities are still holding up. I was honestly expecting the shadows to be a little bit more murky than they are. Now at full spot, the shadows are not as sharp as they once were, but again, I really am surprised at the quality of the shadows. This is still usable if you need to make that compromise to get firepower. Now here I've deliberately got the barn doors all the way open so that you can see the spill light coming off the Fresnel. I'm doing this to help you gauge if this would really be an issue for you or not. In flood, it has that typical soft drop off to the edges that I would expect from a regular Fresnel. Now let's put this unit into full spot, and this is where things get really different. This has really clean beam edges. Some of you will see this as a pro, and for others, this will not be what your cinematographer is expecting from a Fresnel in full spot. Me personally, I'm a fan of it. Now when I box up the barn doors, you can see that it gets rid of the spill. However, the barn doors seem to have a little bit more sheen than I would like, which results in the spill light at the base of the stand. This is typical of a lot of Fresnels. Now let's take a look at some spectrometer information for this modifier. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3180 with an SSI score of 85. The TN30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0010, which would give it ever so slightly a magenta colour hue to a little bit less than 1/3 of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5550 with an SSI score of 88. The TM30 colour testing scores were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0020. So if you're working to the Planchet curve, the light will have a slight green colour hue to roughly the equivalent of 2/3 of a 1/8 correction gel. But just to note here, the light is set to CIE daylight, not to the Planchet or black body curve. And if your camera's working to the daylight curve, then this would have an imperceivable magenta colour hue to roughly the equivalent of 1/3 of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's do a walkthrough of the UI. You've got the power button here which glows bright green when the light is turned off. and when you power it on, the light goes white. Above the power button, you've got your one knob that you can use to select your parameter, and if you press it in, you can then change the values in the parameter you've selected. Below the screen, you've got 4 buttons: Menu, Light Mode, Preset, and Back. Let's start off by having a look at our Light Mode button. First light mode option is CCT. The intensity can be adjusted in 0.1% increments. Next parameter of adjustment is your CCT or Kelvin. This can be adjusted in 50 Kelvin increments. The lowest Kelvin is 1800 and the top Kelvin is 20,000. The next parameter of adjustment is green and magenta, and this can be adjusted in 1% increments. 100% magenta is the equivalent of a full magenta gel, and 100% green is the equivalent of a full plus green gel. Let's go back to our light modes menu now, and the next mode of operation is HSI-C+. In this mode, you can adjust your intensity in 0.1% increments. The next parameter of adjustment is your CCT, which again is tunable in 50 Kelvin increments. You can add a green and magenta value to this. Then you can select your color hue, which is selectable in 0.1 degree increments. And finally, you can adjust your saturation in 0.1% increments. The next mode of operation is RGB, and this is pretty straightforward. You can adjust your intensity in 0.1% increments, and you can adjust your red, green and blue channels in 0.1% increments. Note that the square gives you a visual representation of the color that's being generated. Next mode of operation is your gels library. You can adjust your intensity in 0.1% increments. You can select your base CCT for the gel, either between 3200 Kelvin and 5600. You can select whether you're using Roscoe or a Lee gel library selection, and you can select the gel library from which you are selecting your gel. Next mode of operation is source. In this mode, you can replicate real-life light sources. Next mode of operation is XY. Next is your special effects menu. And this is an icon-driven menu, and it's pretty much the same special effects that you'd expect from an Aputure light. And finally, you've got your custom Sidus link effects. Let's now go to the main menu, and from here we can select control settings. You can select lead and follow mode, and you can also do your DMX settings from here. Let's take a look in the DMX menu. We've got our DMX status screen we can turn on. Next option is you can set your DMX address. At any stage you want to go back in the menu, press the back button. We can select our DMX profile. Now, because we have a massive amount of DMX profiles, they have these divided into categories. Next, we can select our DMX loss behavior. You've got a choice of hold last setting, blackout, fade to black, and hold for 2 minutes and then fade out. Next in the menu is our DMX smoothing. You've got a choice of off, feather, smooth, or super smooth. Smooth is the fastest responding DMX smoothing. To help you figure out which one is which, there is an icon of the sun which will adjust at the speed that the smoothing works. Last thing in the DMX menu is your DMX termination. Next in the menu is our CRMX settings. We can turn the CRMX on and off. We can select whether this is a transmitter or a receiver. We can link and unlink. But one very important option is you can set the light to retransmit the CRMX data via the wired cable out. And you can also select your linking key. Next in the menu is your Sidus link options. Next we've got our Ethernet options. You can view your IP address. You can set your protocol. You can select your IP mode, you can select your universe, and you can select your DMX address. Going back from the main menu now, let's have a look at our system settings. You can select your dimmer curve, you can select your output mode between maximum output and constant output. Constant output gives you the same light value output regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Next, you can select your white light standard. You've got a choice of CIE daylight, which is what most professional cameras work to, or you can set the light to follow the black body or Planckian curve, which is the standard that most lighting manufacturers follow. Next, you can select your high speed mode on and off. If you select high speed, the light is completely flicker free, but can't be dimmed below 40%. We can select our fan modes, and we've got the usual choices: smart, high, medium, and silent. And you can also select DMX controlled. With that enabled, you can use a DMX profile to turn your fans on and off between takes. Next is our studio mode. If the light is set to studio mode, it will automatically turn on when it receives power. We've got our screensaver, we've got our language mode, we've got product information. This tells us our firmware version, our serial number, a Sidus Bluetooth ID, our hardware version, and we can go down to operating status. Clicking on operator status gives you information like the current temperature. We can have a look at the fixture runtime, and for maintenance, you can have a look at the system errors. We have firmware update, and the last thing in the menu is factory reset. So before we get into talking about the DMX, I just wanted to quickly show you the type of yellow this light can create, because it wasn't that long ago that we couldn't create yellow. It was the holy grail of light. All right, let's talk about the DMX now. And the one big plus for this in terms of its DMX, it has 90 DMX profiles. Now they're organized into groupings. You've got your basic DMX, you've got your DMX control profiles. So in your control profiles, you can do things like turn the fans on and off. You can select your smoothing. You can even toggle on and off your Bluetooth control for, say, your Sidus link. But I have found in some of these profiles, the controls don't work properly. It does need a little bit of tweaking, so hopefully that'll get sorted out soon. And you've also got all of your color space profiles. So it doesn't matter if you're a small-time gaffer like me, working on corporate videos, or if you're working in a volumetric studio, you've got a profile to suit. But here's what I really love about some of the profile selections. Now, we've all seen crossover profiles and they're great. So you've got like CCT plus HSI or CCT plus RGB. These guys have what I think is something really special. CCT plus HSI plus special effects, or CCT plus RGB plus special effects. So one of the things that I like about this sort of profile is I've got all of my CCT control at my fingertips. I've also got my full green and magenta control. And of course, I can crossfade in a color over these settings. But the thing I really like is if I have to go into an effects mode, say for example candle, I can dial that in without having all of the channels getting taken up that an ultimate mode would use. In terms of a negative, when you select an effect over DMX, it isn't just triggering a subroutine in the controller to run the manual effect. These effects have been reprogrammed. Now, one of the negatives for me is some of these effects, like club lights, which I'm currently running, don't have a randomizer. So if you've selected the maximum amount of colors, it looks to just be scrolling around the color vectors in sequence and fading the light up and down, which does not make for a convincing club light effect. So that got me thinking, why on earth would someone go to all of the effort of reprogramming the effects twice? There must be some sort of advantage they were trying to get over having the effects in DMX. And I did find it when I had a bit more of a play. So say our club lights, for example. With the effects version over DMX, you can dial in a CCT, a green magenta value, and then desaturate the lighting effect to that base CCT. So when you go into your close-ups on your actors, they're not getting hit by a really vibrant light that distracts from their performance. So with a bit of tweaking, a bit of randomization put into the effects, I reckon they're onto something special here. And another pro for me is the DMX status screen. So my DMX isn't working at the moment, and I can see I've got the correct profile selected. I can see my address is correct. I know I've got the right dimmer curve. I can see that it's in studio mode, so it's going to turn on as soon as it gets power, but it tells me quite clearly that it's not receiving any DMX data. So I know what the fault is. It's not linked to my CRMX transmitter. Okay, we have the Storm 1000C. This is operating in mode 14, which is a 16-bit CCT plus HSI plus effects profile. To give you something to compare it to, I have the Nanlux Evoke 900C. This is running in its 16-bit CCT HSI crossover profile. Both lights are receiving identical commands at the same time via the Blackout lighting console software. The iPad running the Blackout software is directly hardwired into a Cerise 4-universe transmitter, which refreshes the data stream at 41 Hz. At this stage of the test, both lights have their smoothing turned on, and the aperture is set to its fastest responding smoothing option. Let's start off the testing with instant on-off commands. Now let's do the same test again, but this time with the smoothing turned off. Now let's have a look at some half-second cues with the smoothing turned back on. Now let's look at some 1-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5-second cues. And now some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers and the smoothing turned off. Now let's have a look at instant changeovers, this time with the DMX smoothing turned back on. Now let's have a look at some half-second changeovers. Now for some 1-second changeovers. Some 2.5-second changeovers. And now for some 5-second changeovers. Now let's have a look at an instant changeover command between a CCT and a color hue with the smoothing turned off. Now let's do the same test again, but this time with the smoothing turned back on. Now for a half-second changeover. Now a 1-second changeover. Now a 2.5-second changeover. And now a 5-second changeover. Now let's do the Cue test again, but this time with the maximum brightness on the lights set to 10%. So we are fading between 10% and 0. And these tests are with the smoothing on. The Evoke only has the one smoothing setting, and we're going to leave the aperture set to its fastest responding smoothing. Let's start off with some half-second cues. Now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's run those same tests again, but this time set the aperture light to its super smooth smoothing option. And let's start off with half-second cues. Now for some 1-second cues. Two and a half second cues. and for anyone who's still awake, some 5-second cues. Now let's go through all the data I've collected, and just something I want to note, that all of the values were taken with no modifier attached and the light set to the CIE daylight standard. Let's start off with the AC power draw. The maximum power draw automatically recorded over several days of testing was 1209 watt. At 3200 Kelvin it's pulling 1205 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin it's pulling 1182 watt. And if you're looking at dimming lots of these in a studio, you shouldn't have any problem with your power distribution because the power factor unity scores are very good. Now running in its standard dimming mode, it's running at pulse width modulation with a frequency of 20 kHz. In its high speed mode, it is using constant current dimming. This should be 100% flicker free because there is no frequency. Now let's take a look at the dimming results for 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, 1%, and 0.1%. The amount the light dims compared to the target value is very accurate. The CCT remains very consistent, even down at 0.1%. The TM30 color render scores are a constant 95 all the way down to 5%, then they actually go up to 96. And the white point placement is very consistent, although it does go a little bit green right towards the very end, below 1%. But even taking this into account, the total amount of variation is less than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's take a look at 5600 Kelvin. The amount the light dims compared to the target value is pretty good. The CCT remains pretty accurate all the way down to 1%. With the TM30 color render scores, you've got a constant 97 across the entire dimming range. The delta UV, white point or color hue remains very consistent all the way down to 5%. Then below 5%, it does skew a little bit towards green. Now let's take a look at the CCT Target Accuracy. And I've taken readings at every Kelvin between 1800 to 7000 Kelvin, where I stopped taking individual readings. Now just to note, these readings are taken without a modifier attached. The light is actually way more accurate with the supplied reflector. Now let's take a look at the color render scores measured in TM30RF. And we're going to break it down into a few sections. Starting off with 1800 Kelvin to 2000 Kelvin. The light scoring between 85 and 87 in this section. Now let's take a look at 2050 to 2800 Kelvin. And in this Kelvin range, the light increases from a low score of 88 up to a score of 94. Now let's take a look at 2850 all the way up to 7000 Kelvin, where I stopped taking individual readings. The lowest score is a 95 and the highest score is a 97. Just glancing at these figures might give you an incorrect perception of the light's accuracy. The light actually has a color render score of 97 across 82% of this CCT range. Now let's take a look at the white point placement measured in delta UV. And just a few things to note. The light is set to CIE daylight, so at 4000 Kelvin, the delta UV scores should lift up as the light tracks away from the Planckian curve and heads towards the daylight curve. Between 1800 Kelvin to 4000 Kelvin, it is tracking slightly below the Planckian curve with an average delta UV of minus 0.0008, which would make it imperceivably magenta to roughly 1/4 of a 1/8 correction gel. Between 4050 to 5000 Kelvin, I'm not giving an average because the light deviates from the Planckian curve up to the daylight curve. Between 5050 Kelvin to 7000 Kelvin, where I stopped taking individual readings, it is tracking closer to the daylight curve than the Planckian curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0023. Now let's have a look at a snapshot of some of our higher Kelvins from 7000 to 10,000 taken in 500 Kelvin increments. Now let's have a snapshot of 11,000 Kelvin to 20,000 Kelvin taken in 1000 Kelvin increments. Now let's take a closer look at some of the CCTs, starting off with the lowest CCT that we can dial in. And just to note, I took these readings with no modifier attached, and the light set to CIE daylight. Now, maybe that was a mistake because the light is clearly calibrated to work with the supplied reflector and gives you almost perfect CCT target accuracy results. And also, if you're using the Fresnel, the CCT target accuracy is also better than the results we're going to have here. When I dialed in 1800 Kelvin, I got 1790. The TN30 colour testing results were 85% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores R7, R8, R9 and R15 were all below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is fairly accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0007. When I dialed in 2500 Kelvin, I got 2479. The colour render scores have increased up to a 92% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R8 and R9 are below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is pretty accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0007. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3173 with an SSI score of 86. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is pretty accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0006. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4359. The TN30 colour render results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0007. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5513 with an SSI score of 89. The TN30 colour testing results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0025. So if you're working to the Planckian curve, this would be slightly green to roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. This is again with the light set to CIE daylight. And if you're working to the daylight curve, it'll be imperceivably magenta. When I dialed in 10,000 Kelvin, I got 10,007. The TN30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9, R11, R12 and R15 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point had a delta UV of plus 0.0024. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 20,000, I got 20,905. This is outside the range of a TM30 colour vector test. With the CRI scores, 7 of them are below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0023. Let's take a look at some of the colour vector numbers. When I dialed in 0 degrees or 180 degrees, which is red, I got 3 degrees. When I dialed in 120 degrees or green, I got 117. Blue was smack on at 240 degrees. Now this has an interesting spectrum distribution, not what I was expecting. When I dialed in 60 degrees or yellow, I got 63. And this is a nice fat spectrum. Cyan, which should be 180 degrees, came in at 190. And this is a better spectrum distribution than you'd get off an RGB light, and magenta came in at 280 degrees. Okay, so just my closing thoughts. This light is a yes and a no from me at the same time. I have two lighting vans. I have a small lighting van and a large lighting van. Now the small lighting van isn't the large lighting van with less equipment in it. It actually has completely different lights because the clientele for both vans have different needs. So in my smaller van, which does more intimate jobs like interviews or product shots, things like that, I have the Blairs. I've got 5 Blair light engines in that van. So I've got 3 of the 1200Xs and 2 of these 1000Cs. Now my larger lighting vehicle, that is full of Evokes because I need DMX cueing for that vehicle. Every job I do has usually 5 DMX cues when I'm working out of that lighting van. And they can be DMX cues which are triggered by the point at which the camera is, by the position of the actor, by an actor's action, maybe flicking a light switch or something like that. I can't use this because of the DMX delay. I can't have a half-second DMX delay on a light. Also with that larger van, with the setups that does, it tends to do bigger scenes. So I need a light that has a hard light modifier that goes wider than 45 degrees. And that isn't this. But if it had decent DMX response, I would probably sell all of those Evokes tomorrow and buy these. That's the thing. So for some of us, DMX cueing really is a critical decision maker now. I'm Andrew Locke. Thank you for watching Gaffer and Gear. See you on the next episode. The next negative for me is there's only one knob on the controller, and yes, I get it. It looks more stylish with one knob, but you know something? Gaffers don't give a shit. Now let's cover off the pros. This locking mechanism is incredibly simple to use. This locking mechanism is incredibly simple to use.